US President Donald Trump says he's optimistic about a trade deal with the European Union.
President Trump at the White House. Meloni was the only EU leader to be invited to the president's inauguration and hopes to act as a mediator on tariffs.
Well, I do like her very much. I think she's a
European Union. My goal would be invite President Trump to pay an official visit to Italy and understand if there's a possibility when he comes to organize also such a meeting with Europe.
On April 17th, Trump didn't meet Europe. He met Italy. And that changed more than just the guest list. But was it just symbolic, or something far more dangerous? 1 year ago, Ursula von der Leyen stood beside President Biden, representing not just a country, but the collective voice of 27 nations. Because when Trump opened the door this time, he didn't invite Europe. He invited Italy. Giorgia Meloni walked in alone. No EU mandate. No Bloc coordination. Just a leader, speaking only for herself. And that shift, subtle as it was, may have said more than any summit could. So the question now is, when one speaks alone, does Europe still speak at all? Just a year ago, the image was strikingly different. The transatlantic alliance still carried the air of unity, purpose, and carefully coordinated strength. When European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen stood beside President Joe Biden at the White House, it wasn't just two leaders speaking. It was Brussels speaking with one voice, the voice of 27 nations, backed by decades of integration, economic alignment, and political cohesion. Their handshake symbolized the legitimacy of bloc diplomacy. The US wasn't negotiating with one country, it was negotiating with the European Union as a single, structured partner. Around the same time, French President Emmanuel Macron shared the global stage with Biden at the G7 summit in Hiroshima. They stood shoulder to shoulder on issues ranging from climate to China to economic resilience, framing themselves not just as allies, but as co-architects of the rules-based international order. And then there was German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, coordinating closely with Washington at the NATO summit in Vilnius. Whether in defense, energy, or trade, Europe's major capitals were aligned, not perfectly but tightly enough to stand as a bloc. It wasn't just diplomacy, it was choreography. Precise, rehearsed, and intentional. But this year, something shifted. As the White House doors opened once again, there was no banner of the EU, no Brussels, no multi-nation delegation. Ursula von der Leyen, the one person charged with representing the collective interests of Europe, has yet to secure a meeting with President Trump. She's extended the hand, no handshake. Instead, a different figure was welcomed. Giorgia Meloni, Prime Minister of Italy. She arrived alone. Not as a representative of 27 nations, but as the leader of one. No mandate from the EU Council, no coordinating brief from Brussels, just a private meeting, a bilateral lunch, a closed-door session that would end with no formal agreements, but with one powerful precedent.
I cannot deal in the name of the European Union. My goal would be invite President Trump to pay an official visit to Italy and understand if there's a possibility when he comes to organize also such a meeting with Europe.
It was a quiet sentence, polite, measured, but in it lay something far more dangerous than volume: deniability. That single sentence opened a path for Trump to negotiate directly with European states, one by one, bypassing the very architecture of EU unity. A door had been opened, but where does it lead? Cooperation or unravels? To a new order in which Europe no longer speaks with one voice, but 27 conflicting ones? Or worse, to a negotiation game where the first to step through the door sets the price, and the rest are left bargaining in isolation. The meeting between Giorgia Meloni and Donald Trump lasted over 2 hours, an unusually long duration for what was officially billed as a courtesy visit. There was no press conference, no podium, no joint statement, and crucially, no trade agreement. When the doors reopened, Meloni began speaking not as a representative of Europe, but as the head of a nation ready to pivot. She confirmed that Italy, a country with a $45 billion trade surplus with the United States, would increase its purchases of American liquefied natural gas. A subtle but unmistakable shift, given how energy dependence has become the new axis of geopolitical leverage. Then came the commitment that Italy would finally move to meet the 2% NATO defense spending threshold, a benchmark that Trump has long used to judge European allies, and one that Italy has chronically fallen short of. As if that weren't enough, Meloni also announced billions in new Italian investments into the US market, effectively deepening economic interdependence at a moment when the EU's collective bargaining posture is being tested. All of this in the absence of any formal bilateral deal. Then, just as the room seemed to be settling, Trump delivered a line that disrupted the silence. There will be a trade deal with the EU 100%. But here's the catch. The EU wasn't in the room. Von der Leyen wasn't there. And yet, the phrase trade deal with the EU was invoked, not by Europe, but by Washington. This wasn't just about tariffs or exports. It wasn't about trade at all. It was about rewriting the rules of engagement, about changing the structure of who gets to sit at the table and who doesn't. Because when Trump talks about a deal with the EU while meeting with a single European leader, he's not proposing a negotiation. He's proposing a replacement for one. He's signaling a future where bilateral deals become the new default, and the bloc becomes little more than a shell, silently bypassed. And once that precedent is set, just one member state gets a better seat by acting alone, the very idea of negotiating with Europe fades under its own irrelevance. This wasn't trade. It was a recalibration of who gets to matter and who no longer does. If they don't want to negotiate, I'll make the deal for them. The sentence was delivered with characteristic bravado. So far, President Trump has not granted a meeting to Ursula von der Leyen, the sitting president of the European Commission and the highest-ranking voice for the entire bloc. Despite repeated outreach, despite her position as the legal and political representative of 27 member states, the door to the Oval Office has remained closed. Instead, Trump accepted an entirely different invitation from Giorgia Meloni, not from Brussels, not from the EU Council, but from Rome. He agreed to visit Italy, and perhaps during that visit to hold informal meetings with other European leaders. But not in a summit, not as a delegation, not under the architecture of the European Union. These would be separate conversations one-on-one outside the frameworks that Europe has spent decades building, and precisely that is the strategy. It is the active strategy of those who want to rewrite who gets to matter and who doesn't. So why did Giorgia Meloni arrive first? Why her? Why now? Because 1 week earlier, Donald Trump didn't just change the rules of trade. He triggered a global economic shockwave. Without warning, the White House announced a sweeping tariff escalation, a 20% blanket tariff on all goods imported from the European Union, a 145% tariff targeting Chinese exports, and a 10% base tariff applied across the rest of the world, allies and adversaries alike. This wasn't a policy. It was a shockwave. Markets plunged, currency blocks wobbled, export-reliant industries froze. From Berlin to Brussels to Beijing, governments scrambled for answers, but none came. There were no briefings, no warning signs, no diplomatic backchannels, only silence. And then a twist. Trump paused everything, a 90-day suspension of all tariffs. It was a test. Who would move first? Who would blink? That someone was Meloni. She didn't come as a protester. She didn't come to bargain for Brussels. She came alone, to talk, to listen, to open a door. And in doing so, she became the first European leader to re-enter the room, not through a joint mandate, but through a private invitation. The dominoes are already shifting. Several Eastern European nations, quietly, cautiously, are signaling interest in direct bilateral talks with Washington. They're watching Italy closely, not just to see what Meloni secured, but to see what she gave up and what she may have gained in return. And yet, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, the symbolic and institutional voice of 27 nations, still has no scheduled meeting with President Trump. And Trump, he's not hiding the strategy. He has made no moves toward returning to multilateralism, no statements reaffirming transatlantic unity, no gestures toward restoring EU-US dialogue. Because the strategy doesn't require a fight, it doesn't require dismantling the EU. It only requires waiting for each country to decide on its own that unity is no longer in its interest. What do you think? Is Trump building a new transactional world order or dismantling the strongest collective bargaining bloc on the planet? Is Meloni a clever negotiator or the first piece in a broader fragmentation strategy? Let us know in the comments.